For Aerospace and Security Studies is an independent think tank based in Islamabad, working on issues concerning security and aerospace. Ladies and gentlemen, EU Disinfolab, a European non-governmental organization, published a report titled Indian Chronicles that brought to surface the extent of a disinformation campaign originating from India, targeting Pakistan through fake news, false testimonies at the UN Human Rights Commission, and malicious propaganda involving the EU members of the parliament. Commenting on the scale of this network, the executive director of the EU Disinfolab, Alexander Alaphilippe, stated that this is the largest network we have exposed that was designed primarily to discredit Pakistan internationally. The webinar on Indian Chronicles aims to discuss the nature of Indian disinformation campaign, assess the damages it has caused, and explore a way forward to detect and stop such activities in future. To begin the formal proceedings, I kindly request President Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Sadat for his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sitara. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar on Indian Chronicles. And a very special welcome to Dr. Moeed Yusuf. He will join us in another 3-4 minutes perhaps. But in the meantime, I would like to welcome Dr. Moeed Yusuf, Ms. Ramsha Jahangir, and Mr. Awais Anwar for joining us again for this activity of ours. I hope Dr. Moeed Yusuf will be with us in 2-3 minutes. If not, then we will proceed with the rest of the speakers and maybe need to modify the proceedings a little bit. The original plan was that Dr. Moeed Yusuf was to deliver his keynote address, and after a short Q&A, he was to leave because his rules of business do not allow him to be a member of a panel. So that may perhaps raise apprehensions in the other speakers. Welcome, Dr. Moeed. We had just started. Walaikum assalam. Walaikum assalam. I was just giving out the details of the proceedings today. I was telling them that Dr. Moeed Yusuf will deliver the keynote address, and after a short Q&A, he would leave us. And after that, the other speakers would deliver their talks. I want to reassure the other speakers that Dr. Moeed's Q&A will not steal your thunder. There will be plenty of question and answer opportunity in the later session. And as is usual, we realize that in every webinar, there is not enough time for all the questions to be answered. So I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion. The speakers will talk about the details, the malice, and the sophistication of this disinformation campaign and what Pakistan can do to prevent its recurrence. I just want to say that it has proven, if ever there was a proof required, of Indian hatred and animosity towards Pakistan. We told the world about the multi-domain hybrid war being waged against Pakistan, but the world paid no heed to it. Thankfully, the Disinformation Lab did the job for us. Apparently, the world still remains unmoved. The unrelenting obsession of Hindutva-driven India to harm Pakistan is incomprehensible. India could live and let live Pakistan in peace, but it doesn't and it cannot. The consequence is an unstable and insecure, underdeveloped neighborhood. So all these issues would be addressed in great detail by the speakers that follow me. And I will hand over the proceedings of the webinar back to Ms. Tara Noor, who is our Senior Research Associate. Sitara, over to you, please.
Thank you, sir. We are very pleased to have with us Special Assistant to the Prime Minister on National Security Division and Strategic Policy Planning, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, as a keynote speaker, as the President CAS has already highlighted. Before joining the government, Dr. Yusuf has had an illustrious career in academics and policy and has worked at various international think tanks, including US Institute of Peace as Associate Vice President for Asia, Long Range Future at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, Muzaffar Rahmani Center at Harvard University's Kennedy School, and the Brookings Institution. He has published widely in national and international journals, professional publications, and magazines. His latest book, Brokering Peace in Nuclear Environments, US Crisis Management in South Asia, was released by the Stanford University Press in May 2018. I request Dr. Moeed Yusuf for your keynote address, and I want to inform the audience again that followed by his keynote speech, there would be some time for question and answer. You may write down your question in the question and answer box. I'll leave that further towards Mr. Yusuf. Dr. Yusuf, you have the floor, please. You have to unmute yourself. Dr. Yusuf, you have to unmute yourself, please.
Still learning the new tricks of this trade. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Air Chief Marshal Saab, Cass, it's a great opportunity for me and I'm honored to be here. Just to clarify, the real reason for not being in the panel is that I usually pull down the quality of panels. So I try and avoid that embarrassment. Other speakers are much more worthy than I am, especially in this case, as I know at least two of them. Q&A also, please, anything and everything is fine. I mean, I'm happy to answer whatever. This is not a way for me to get away from tough questions. So I'll stick around and answer whatever people want. Let me briefly lay out what I think is the critical point. I'm not going to get into data on how many countries and how many news outlets India was using, etc. Let me just make a larger point, which is, what is the Pakistan of today? The seat that I sit on, what am I working with and on, and where do we want to go? What is the Pakistan of today versus what is the India of today? So the first thing to register is that Pakistan is a country that is whose vision, as instructed by the Prime Minister, with a consensus across the board in the leadership, is a country squarely focused on an economic security paradigm. This economic security paradigm has three pillars. Number one, connectivity in the region, to use our geo-economic location to the best effect possible. We've talked about geostrategic location for decades. Yes, it is true that exists. It hasn't given us the dividends that we've hoped for. We focused on a geo-economic location. So connectivity is crucial. Second, development partnerships with the world, not assistance. Of course, we will need assistance from the world, but what we are focused on is opportunities for real development and investment partnerships. And third is what we call a responsible state that is responsible to its own citizens as well as beyond its borders. Now, this area of beyond its borders, for today's seminar, the most important element of that is peace in the region. Because unless you have peace in the region, you can't have connectivity optimized. You can't have the economic resource to fulfill the vision of an economic security paradigm. Development partnerships will happen when you have peace, and investment will come because of that, or partly because of that, in the country. So that's the overarching vision under which there is a strong push on economic diplomacy when it comes to Pakistan's engagement with the world now. This is a major shift, and I don't need to sort of go into details, but this is where Pakistan is heading. Now, where is the eastern neighbor? The eastern neighbor is pursuing an ideology which is totally exclusive of all other thought processes except Hindutva, which is self-proclaimed to be an expansionist ideology, where the officials are publicly talking about military action against Pakistan, where the country is actually in a conflict or a spat with every single neighbor, and where, frankly, you are dealing with a group of people who are running Pakistan's policy in India, who are pathological haters of Pakistan, who spent a lifetime making a career out of undermining Pakistan. So in a nutshell, frankly, you're dealing with a mafia bent upon undermining our country. Now, this is also the group of people who has formally and publicly said that they will take unilateral decisions to resolve their disputes. They have rubbished all international law obligations as far as illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. They've even all but disregarded the Shimla Agreement, which is what they used to hold on to justify not wanting third parties to come in and have conversations on and try and help resolve the Kashmir dispute. This is a country that is making unilateral decisions smack in the face of international law obligations. So it's essentially a classic definition of a rogue state. At the strategic level, I've explained to you, it's expansionist. It cannot tolerate a stable and prosperous Pakistan. But there's also a very interesting tactical level. And the tactical level is cyber activity against Pakistan. It is perpetrating terrorism, which is, of course, both strategic and tactical, but to the minutest detail. And if you've all noticed the dossier that we put out, it has extensive details of the kind of activities that India is undertaking, which leaves no doubt that it is a formal, official, deliberate, conscious state sponsor of terrorism. But then you also have a level where literally the very top of the country is getting articles planted against Pakistan, against Pakistani officials, cyber security compromises against Pakistan is happening every day from the very, very top. And the very top is also responsible for creating a CPEC cell, $70 million to begin with. All of this is in the dossier. So this is really a country who's taken up for itself a full-time effort to undermine, destabilize, and hold Pakistan back from its economic security vision. What is our challenge? Our challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is that unfortunately, India has been ahead of us in the game of perceptions and narrative building. It has actually managed to create, and I don't have time to go into the reasons, they're all, by the way, nefarious and as malign as any of their other activities. A narrative which supports them, where the world thinks they're going to defend global interests, or Western interests, I should say, against China, where it's a big market, it's importing arms, it's going to stand by them. None of that is going to happen because India is on a suicidal path itself. But it is true that their narrative has been bought by the US and some other Western countries. Now, I am sorry, long-winded way to come to your main topic, which is, how do they create this perception and why do they create this perception? So the answer to why is that this is the disinformation campaign that they use to take the pressure off from them and then do activities to undermine Pakistan. They support terrorism, they support all sorts of illegal actions against Pakistan. They do what they're doing in IIOJK. And the way they get away without being taken down, questioned, and in fact, the world turning a blind eye, is that they create a narrative and have created a narrative in which Pakistan is the villain and they are the victim. And the EU Disinfo Lab, Indian Chronicles, ladies and gentlemen, is the tip of the iceberg, which explains what they do to create this narrative. Why is it that the Air Chief Marshal has to say that we go to the world and tell them and the world pays no heed? Well, it's because, not only because, they buy arms and they pretend that they're going to be a bulwark against China, but because they have created this criminal campaign And we only know, the world only knows 15 years. It's been going on for much longer. Let me also tell you, the report says everything but saying that it's the Indian state. Let me make this clear. This entire thing is an Indian state / raw operation. We know this for a fact. We have evidence, no question about it. This operation has done a number of things. It's proven that the Indian media outlets, which pretend to be very respected, are actually part of the intelligence network to perpetrate disinformation. It proves that India will go to any and every length to undermine Pakistan, to create this narrative, to be able to create space to use terrorism against Pakistan and everything else, so that they're not questioned as much as any other state would be, creating a sort of villain impression of Pakistan. They have used fake identities. There is identity theft involved. There is misrepresentation involved. There is fraud involved in multiple European and Western jurisdictions. The international intellectual property rights have been violated. All of these are crimes. These are not unethical things. These are not only immoral things. These are actually crimes under law. And thus, in multiple jurisdictions, the perpetrators are liable for prosecution. Let me say 2 or 3 other things, and I know I'm sort of reaching the end of my time. Number one, international conventions have been violated. Bilateral agreements, Liaquat Nehru Pact, the Shimla Agreement Article 2 have been violated. The UN system has been cheated through these fake NGOs. I've already given you some of the other crimes that have been committed. And so let me just tell you where we are on this as Pakistan. First of all, we wrote to the EU Parliament President. There is an inquiry that has been internal inquiry that's already been ordered by the EU Parliament. I don't know whether you note, any of you noted or not. SADF, the organization South Asia, whatever Development Forum, whatever it was called, the entire board resigned yesterday or day before, and stated that they were duped into becoming board members of this organization as part of this disinformation campaign. And I take it with a pinch of salt, because the names on the board, you have to be really stupid not to realize what was going on. ECOSOC, the UN mechanism, the committee, NGOs need to be delisted there. That is a process that has to be initiated. All the crimes that have been committed, there are people who've been wronged. There are institutions and organizations that have been wronged. Pakistan can raise the voice, but it's those people who've been wronged who now need to take legal action. And we will, of course, continue to raise this and hope that they are going to take these actions. And a lot of that Pakistan can, of course, facilitate, and we have every right to do that. So that's another whole lawfare and legal recourse that we have to follow. And then, of course, there's the UN system. Can such a country be sitting in the UN Security Council and pretending to be a adherent of international law when these are the kind of activities that they're undertaking? Ultimately, frankly, it is a failure of the UN system. How were these organizations listed and appearing to badmouth Pakistan for so long? Why is it that this wasn't unearthed before? It is also very unfortunate. Some Pakistanis have been involved in this. Some names are out there, some are not, but unfortunately, some Pakistanis, especially those sitting abroad and pontificating on Pakistan all the time, we know who's been involved in what they were doing deliberately, and some, unwittingly. So all of this to say, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a situation where there's a full-blown attack against Pakistan in every possible way short of war. There's the cyberspace, there's the information space, there's the terrorism space, there is, at the end of the day, the international space also, FATF and others, Now, the dossier we put out, there are clear links between what India was doing in terms of terror financing, etc., and this disinformation campaign that was being used as a cover. So if this is not enough for the world to wake up, then I'm afraid that the world does not care about peace in this region. Because for a country that's going down this path in a nuclear region, for a country that's talking about military misadventures, where we know they have attempted, we've brought it out in public knowledge, then I'm afraid, we know how to defend ourselves, but the world may simply not be interested in doing the right thing, and that'll be a huge tragedy. As far as we are concerned, we continue to stand for peace. The economic security paradigm that I talked about is truly where we want to go. The Prime Minister of Pakistan has repeatedly said, take one step, we'll take 2 steps forward. Unfortunately, India is running in the opposite direction, 100 steps at a time. We still say we are for peace and dialogue. But to get there, you have to get to a point in Jammu and Kashmir where international law dictates where we go to resolve the issue. You have to stop perpetrating terrorism against Pakistan. You must apologize, because it's under international law. India must apologize to Pakistan and many other countries and those it has wronged through this disinformation campaign. We are there to find peace, but under the current circumstances, I'm afraid I have to be very honest and tell you I see no scope for it and no scope for forward movement as we stand. The difference, and this is my last point, that I want everybody to recognize, is that India is in a quandary. India is responding so childishly and in a sort of knee-jerk manner when statements are made from Pakistan, when dossiers are put out, because Pakistan is now approaching the world under the new doctrine or paradigm that I keep repeating: unapologetic, proactive, and pragmatic. If India or anybody thinks that Pakistan will just sit back and say, well, this is what it is, what's the point of raising this, what's the point of knocking every door, what's the point of being proactive in telling the world what this country, so-called state, is doing, well, that's not happening anymore. It will be unapologetic, it will be proactive, but pragmatic. We're not talking emotions, we're not talking any conflict, we're talking peace and pragmatism. But this is how we will approach it. We put out a dossier. We'll continue to do things which will show the world India's true face and Pakistan's rightful picture. And that's where our sort of economic security paradigm comes in. If you allow me, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moeed. That's a very elaborative explanation of all the challenges Pakistan faces and what has been done in so far. And thank you also connecting it with Pakistan's economic diplomacy vision that Pakistan intends to take forward or put that face on front. And that's very timely initiative, considering that the new US government has sworn in, and we look forward how that relates. But this also brings us to the challenge that we are facing and we are discussing right now, that how to actually get these challenges away from us that we are facing currently. And in this regard, we already have a list of questions that I would like to share with you. Mr. Abdullah Tariq has asked that a fact-checking organization in Pakistan reported and published a story on Indian fake news network on 15th of August 2020. That's well before the EU Disinfo published its second report, that the latest report that came, but report could not provide the credible backing as presented by the Disinfo lab because of the lack of resources. So what policies do you think Pakistan needs to put in place to ensure more of these fact-checking organizations sprout and prevail? Because that certainly brings back upon us that this network continued to operate for 15 years, as you rightly stated, perhaps even longer than that. So what action do we really need to put in place to ensure that we not only interdict that, but also ensure that this is brought to the light? What's your take on that?
See, there are 2 or 3 things. First of all, when you say something was going on for 15 years and nobody knew or we didn't know. That's not true. Look, these networks are not physical networks. It's not that you're sitting somewhere and you can physically find a factory or a lab or a person. Because it is all in virtual space, you can pick up parts of what is happening and try and challenge, interdict, or more importantly, call them out and have those things stop. Those things have continued for 15 years. Just because a report has come out today does not mean that the Pakistani state was sleeping for 15 years. And the other part to this is, frankly, this space is not directed at Pakistan physically, right? I mean, there is somebody writing an article to malign Pakistan. If an identity theft has happened in Brussels or in Geneva, it's not my identity that's been stolen. So there are different ways to approach this issue and to tackle it. And this is the space which the entire world is struggling with right now. It's new. We have to deal with this in a different way. And we are also learning. What is true is we are starting late. This hasn't been a strong suit. And there's work going on much before this report to strengthen this area of information space and warfare. But let me also say this. We are not looking at, people have asked me, why haven't you done something like this? We are not going to do things which are illegal. We are not going to do things which are unethical. We will play by the rules as a responsible state does, even though that takes away some of the tools that India has used. But we are a responsible state. Whatever is within the legal limits, it's our right to do. We have to strengthen it. We are trying. But I just object to this idea that some have raised that the state was sleeping for 15 years.
All right. So somewhat similar question from Dr. Usman Jahan, that India has the biggest fake news problem in the world, according to the Microsoft 2019 report. Does this offer an opportunity to construct and disseminate counter-narrative within their discourse flux, as the Voice of America did in Balkans in the 90s, or RT does in Midwest America today?
Yes, I mean, again, this is the entire space of that information challenge, warfare, communication. Keep in mind resources. So we have to understand that these are sometimes very, very expensive endeavors, and we have to see what is the most important legal way of tackling this. Personally, if you ask me, I am a proponent of narratives, not counter narratives. I think what Pakistan has to really focus on telling the world is who we are, what we stand for today. Yes, we have to call India out. But one of our problems, I think, in narrative has been the world says, oh, you do X. And we say, no, we don't do X. The world says, you do Y. We say, no, we don't. So the entire conversation is on talking points prepared by the West and others. And all we are doing is defending ourselves. We need to tell the world who we are. Yes, the world is not interested in listening that we are on an economic security paradigm, that our ease of doing business is up. Yes, we have fixed many problems in the state, and we want investment with China, with US, with Russia, with whatever. The world is not interested. But that's the conversation we need to have with the world. If we spend 25 of the 30 minutes of a official meeting talking about what they want to talk about, that's not going to get us anywhere. So rather than counter narratives, I think we must focus on a very coherent, unified, strong, believable, true national narrative to be projected abroad.
All right. The next question is from Ms. Kanwa Ijaz, and she is asking about the role of the think tank and media outlets, what role they can play in getting maximum out of the proofs provided by the EU Disinfo Lab, basically how to build upon that. And how to shift the narrative, as you rightly said, that perhaps we should always not get into the trouble of responding to the counter narratives, but shifting the narratives perhaps becomes important, and what role think tanks and media can play in that regard.
So our problem, one of our weaknesses, I would argue, has been that the policy making and policy input space have not been linked properly over the years. So the think tank, academia space is not able to contribute as much as it should to policymaking. This is a weakness that at least I have definitely identified in my time in this office. And there's an active effort, Kaleem Sadat Saab knows because he's part of this. The National Security Division is responsible for creating these linkages. So we have just set up a nationwide think tank / university portal, which will be launched in the next 2 or 3 weeks, where we have gotten all registered think tanks working on national security issues broadly defined, and all university departments in the same space. We are going to link them up online through a password protected account, whereby they are able to provide us with policy input on any issue in a digestible format, and then it's upon us to pick the priorities and work with them to get that input. Already, the National Security Division has a council of experts where we have multiple working groups that are giving us regular input. So we've started this process. There are area study centers, 6 area study centers in Pakistan in various universities, which were really not being able to contribute because there was no demand from the state. We've reactivated that, and they're giving input to our policies, and a lot of our work is actually credited to these kind of setups. Overall, we've been very weak. This link has been very weak. We're trying to strengthen it, and this think tank portal, I hope, will be revolutionary in terms of giving access to think tanks in universities, and for the state to be able to convey to these institutions what our narrative is, what we are working on, and hope that they would also work on those areas to give input and to project whatever they're convinced by.
Thank you. And this also relates with the question asked by Mr. Bakhtiyar Hakim, who talked about what remedial measures Pakistan can take, and you partially referred to that. I would link it up with Mr. Sayyid Muhammad Ali's question, who asks that government can build a narrative, can build a fative case for downgrading India internationally based on the evidences that we currently have? Do they correlate with one another? Is that something Pakistan contemplating upon already?
We definitely think they do. We definitely think that India must be put on the list without a doubt. There is so much evidence we've put in the dossier, and there will be much more evidence that they should collect. It's the responsibility of the watchdog. They've made this a political issue against Pakistan. Well, make it a real technical issue against India and figure this out. And next review, when India's up for the next review in the summer, if India is not put in the list, I'd be shocked.
All right. So there is another question from Ms. Dr. Bilal Shahid from, he has joined us from UK. And he says that we know that disinformation campaigns and psychological warfare are the integral components of hybrid warfare, which have gained traction with the proliferation of social media. Do you feel that our precarious economic position coupled with the polarized domestic polity hinders our capacity to effectively respond to this sort of warfare? Again, he has referred to some of the problems that you had already highlighted, but what's your take on this different components of hybrid warfare that Pakistan faces currently, and how do they get played upon?
This is a new space, a relatively new space, and all countries are learning and upgrading and working to make sure they're as secure in this space as possible. Pakistan is not perfect. No country is perfect. We're trying to improve where we can and further strengthen what is already strong. But in terms of the factors laid out, yes, they are a big challenge, and there are many others that are challenges, and we have to reduce the challenges. But more importantly, we also have to build our own capacities where we need to. A lot of areas we are strong, but it's not in the public domain, so it's difficult to see for those who are not in the system. But it's a mix, and I completely accept that there's much more that needs to be done in this space.
All right, and this link it up with the question question by Muhammad or Mr. Umar Amir, who is requesting you to elaborate on how the cleavages in Pakistan's own society be focused on first before we take a front foot against our much larger and much economically stronger eastern neighbor. Of course, there is a realization, but those cleavages and those friction that we face internally hinder our capacity to act outside. What's your take on that?
Look, somebody sitting in my office does not have the luxury to wait to fix something to fix another thing. These things all work simultaneously. Yes, no country that is not internally strong and coherent can optimize its external relationships and outreach to the world. I mean, that's just a plain fact. That's a truism. That said, while a lot of work is going on and has gone into the domestic space and internal reformation, and there are also achievements one can point to, that's no reason for one to not use the space that you have available in the best possible way when you interact with the world. Look, the genius of policy is not to take a good situation and execute it. The genius of policy is that you operate in a constrained environment and manipulate and maneuver in ways that you can get the maximum benefit of whatever hand you've been dealt. So yes, internal reformation, we need to work on that. We are working on that day and night. That is no reason not to optimize under the current circumstances, whatever possible, your external outreach.
Sitara, we can make this the last question so that the other panelists also get a time to speak.
Sir, we are still within the allocated time. I'm conscious
Okay.
of the fact. Yeah, so I'll just submit 2 questions collectively, and then we would move forward to the remaining part of the session. So I would like to merge 2 questions actually from Maheen Shafiq and Ms. Salma Malik. Ms. Salma Malik has asked that what makes Pakistan's submission of the dossier any different from what we have not done in the past. And this also, I would want to relate to the question that Ms. Maheen Shafiq has asked, which essentially says that, which essentially refers to somewhat muted response from the international community, because first to the dossier and now to this Disinfo the report. So these two go hand in hand, because Pakistan has been sharing proofs earlier, but there has been no much follow-up on that. So how does this dossier is different, and how do we gain that necessary traction from the international community and international actors?
So, I mean, I'm glad you've lumped these questions, because I think they are pretty similar in terms of answering them. First of all, the approach is different. The approach is bold, it's unapologetic, it's proactive, it's pragmatic. How? The kind of dossiers that Pakistan or any country, frankly, would put out usually were the ones we used to put out before. Very careful, very cautious, mostly open source information, some information that you had from privileged channels. This dossier is a real indictment. It's got detail after detail of incidences, names, pictures, linkages from terror finance to actual terrorism, IED building, videos. This is not a normal dossier. This is a dossier which intelligence agencies of the world never want to put out, because there are questions of sources compromised and etc., etc. This is the changed approach that Pakistan is taking. We are going to let the world know what the real India is. We don't think our cautious approach has worked. It is true that the world hasn't paid heed. It is also true that the world has not reacted in the way any just world would to the dossier or the EU lab. But that's the second change. We're going to continue pushing this unapologetically. Persistence is going to be our mantra. Why? We know they're not going to listen tomorrow. We know they're not going to listen day after tomorrow. But the burden of evidence is so large here that we feel that the world will have to come back to this for their own sake. When India is causing instability in the region, when India does not perform the responsibility of what they're hoping for vis-a-vis China, because it's crumbling from within, let alone everything else, or leave aside everything else. The other part of this is that when you put this out of the world, we were not good in the past at seeing what benefits or what impact it's having. We now look at this very carefully, and I can guarantee you, having done the analysis, that in the last year and a half, India has been called out, maligned, and questioned by Western press and media in a way that it hasn't in the past 20, 30 years. So it's not that the world can just completely close their eyes to something when the pressure is on. Last point, let's say I agree that there's no benefit, the world doesn't listen to us at all. What's the point of continuing to talk about this and putting out dossiers? Even if the world is not listening, they are more interested in their short-term interests, they're unjust, whatever. How does that mean that I stop raising my voice for what is right, what is true, what is just, what is talking about my people in an occupied territory? I see no reason for that. And that's the change in approach that I'm talking about. I'm not trying to be jingoistic or emotive. This is a real shift in how we're approaching the world. Not everybody is comfortable with it, but this is where we have to go if we want the world to take us seriously. Not tomorrow, maybe, but maybe day after tomorrow, or later than that.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. Thank you very much for very animated question and answers. We really appreciate your time that you have stayed with us for the question and answers also. And we would appreciate if you can take time out to stay with us for the panel as long as you can, of course.
I honestly can't, or I would have. I apologize, okay, but I won't be able to do that. But thank you once again for the opportunity to Cass and to you and to Kaleem Sadat Saab, and good luck to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for being with us.
So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we move on to the next part of our panel discussion. We have an excellent panel of experts with us. Our first speaker is Mr. Ijaz Haider. Mr. Ijaz Haider is the executive editor at Indus News and a columnist for the Friday Times. Previously, he remained associated with various news channels, including Dawn News, Sama, The Capital, and Capital TV. He has written extensively for publications at home and abroad. Mr. Haider, I would want you to draw upon what Mr. Moeed Yusuf had already stated, and how do you assess the extent of damage India's campaign has caused to Pakistan, and what should be the political and diplomatic consequences to disinformation in general and India's campaign in particular? Over to you, sir.
Right. Thank you, Sara. Thank you also to Center for Aerospace and Security Studies for arranging this webinar. Definitely a very important issue. I'm actually going to present some points because we have a question and answer session. So I just want to put this in a perspective and raise these points both for the subsequent discussion, as well as, I hope, to make it a little more provocative. So firstly, we live in a world which is increasingly defined by fake news. Almost all of it is in the digital space. Now, I'm not saying that fakery came into existence with the digital space, but digital space where you have the World Wide Web, which is like a cobweb, and of course the fact that everything that you say travels at the speed of light, it becomes extremely difficult for people to figure out what is fake and what is factual. And there are reasons for it. One, people are gullible. That's a fact. And we structure the world according to our predisposition. Perceptions, multiple psychological studies have noted over decades, are quick to form but resistant to change. So this is the kind of cage in which we are placed, all of us. That includes myself. Not many of us have the time or the capacity to forensically examine what we encounter on the internet. And so very smart people who do not have the skill set to actually figure out forensically what's fake and what's not can fall for fake news. Now, as I said earlier, the web creates a cascading effect, and that allows fakery to snowball. And impressions stay even after something has been debunked. Fake identities, organizations, publications are easy to create, and even when they are found out, the actors can create new ones. The dissemination and spread is well timed, and at lightning pace. Now, this goes back to a couple of questions that were put to Dr. Moeed Yusuf with reference to, why we couldn't detect this, and the fact that there was a Pakistani fact-checking organization that actually put out the story before the EU Disinfo Lab. Frankly, this is a second report. The first report that was put out by EU Disinfo Lab was in 2019. So this 2020 report is a subsequent report and a deeper dive into what Indian Chronicles were doing. Second, fake operations are becoming sophisticated. That makes it even more difficult for those who do not have the tools to sift the grain from the chaff. So, that's something that we have to be aware of. Third, neither is what we today call information war operation. That said, digital space has given information dominance and manipulation a new and far more sinister dimension. My fourth point is about how and why it works. Influence of rely on how humans structure the world. Let me refer to an article that I wrote on this, in which I quoted from the work of Daniel Kahneman, who's the Nobel laureate. His 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, looks into cognitive biases. And the main thesis is that there is a dichotomy between two modes of thinking. So one mode is fast, which he calls system one, and the other is slow, which he calls system two. Now, the fast is instinctive, it's emotional, and it's also informed by our cognitive biases, as well as the requirement to immediately structure the world around. This is a very useful way of thinking, because there are a number of situations that we have to deal with where this system one, fast thinking, hits many a time. So it's not like it's something that should not be there. But as I said, it's not deliberate and it's not logical. That is system two. Now, an overwhelming majority of humankind goes through life without developing the ability to work, what I would say, in and through systems. So system two analysis requires one to actually train oneself to overcome one's immediate responses and bias. And believe me, it's not an easy thing to do. Fifth, studies have shown that humans have too much and undue confidence in human judgment. And I don't think I have to say this, because most of us know that that's how we think. We think that, we can tackle situations. We think that we actually logically approaching a situation, but that's frankly not entirely. Now, this is a very sketchy summation, but it gives us some idea of how and why influence ops can be effective and why perception manipulation becomes easy. And the thing to do is that whoever is operating it needs to understand what buttons to push. My sixth point is to disabuse the audience of the notion that what we call hybrid war, or even more mistakenly fifth generation war, is something new. I have a personal beef with these terms, frankly. I'll be very honest, and I think the sooner we dump these two terms, the better for us. Allied with this is my point that the nature of war does not change. Its conduct does. Influence of has always been a part of war. The digital world and its snowball effect gives them an urgency. And if we really want to understand that this is not something new, we can go as far back as Sun Tzu to see how the conduct of war actually happens. My seventh point is that since the arrival on the political scene of Mr. Narendra Modi and the right-wing RSS BJP government, we seem to forget that India's approach to Pakistan and efforts to undermine it is not a recent phenomenon. This is, to me, a very important point, because it's a structural issue. Here's the evidence. Indian Chronicles date back to 2005. That was the best period of India-Pakistan relations. And India was not ruled by Modi, but guess who? Dr. Manmohan Singh. So, allied with this is my 8th point, given the scale, scope, and sophistication of the operation, and also the funds required for it, as exposed by EU Disinformation, it would be naivete at its most naive to think that a state actor or an intelligence agency of a state actor is not involved in such an operation. So let me quote from what the EU Disinfo Lab said about the operation, and these are their words, not mine. Members of our team all share a common trait, an eye for the fake and a drive to uncover. But never before in our investigations have we been so astonished at the multiplication of layers of fake. Indian Chronicles resurrected dead media, dead think tanks, and NGOs. It even resurrected dead people. The actors behind this operation hijacked the names of others and tried to impersonate regular media and press agencies such as the EU Observer, The Economist, and Voice of America. And this is what the EU Disinfo Lab, prefaces it. My next point is for Pakistan to note the duration of this operation. Normally, actors involved in influence ops target a particular event. Move in, operate, get out. A good example is the Russian op to influence the 2016 US presidential election. This op, on the other hand, was complex, layered, and sustained. What does this mean? It means that this isn't the end of it, and we should brace for more. It also means that we can't just say, oh, the damage. India and Pakistan are locked in a conflicting paradigm. Let's be very clear about that. Indians will do whatever it takes to undermine Pakistan. What we need is to develop the capability to, I would say, plan our own influence ops within the ambit of law, as Dr. Moeed Yusuf talked about, and B, to counter it. It also means that instead of waiting for the EU Disinfo Lab to expose such an op, we should have our own capabilities to do so also. And this is a point that was also raised by a couple of questions that were put to Dr. Moeed. Finally, and I know, there are many more points that one can make. Influence ops don't happen in a vacuum. You can't just weave a yarn out of nothing. This is an important point. And this is where we have to look inward. So you have to link it with the world's perception of a state entity. Now, perception may not be the entire reality, but the fact is that it plays a very important role in how other state actors or how other societies look at a state entity. So this is not about whether the world is fair or not, because it's not. We're not talking about fairness or otherwise. This is real politics, it's mass politics, and as I said, we already have a conflictual paradigm. It is about what one can draw out of the world to one's interest. So the world has a perception of Pakistan, and Indian Chronicles both drew on that as well as perpetuated. That's the important thing. This is why, and I want this point frankly to sink in, if such an op were carried out by Pakistan and had got exposed, all hell would have broken loose. If nothing much has happened, it is because of what India brings to the table. That is a fact, whether we like it or not. And on that point, I will stop. As I said, I've placed some of these points on the table, and we have the Q&A, so we can get to some of these at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Heather, for your initial comments. We'll certainly get back to some of the points that you have raised already during the question and answer session. With that, I move on to our next speaker of this panel discussion, who is Ms. Ramsha Jahangir. Ms. Ramsha is an award-winning journalist and Erasmus Mundus scholar. She writes on disinformation, internet rights, and digital politics. Thank you, Ramsha, for joining us. In your opinion, I specifically want you to focus your talk and your initial remarks on how widespread is India's global disinformation network, and how in your view, as a journalist, how you look at it, that how did it survive for 15 years or actually function very well without being detected? What's your take on that, in addition to what other initial remarks that you have for us? Thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. This has been a very great and insightful session so far, and I'm glad that this issue is being raised the way it is. Regarding the investigation, I think Ijaz Haider also highlighted that this was not the first investigation EU Disinfo did. Their first investigation came out in 2019, where they uncovered 265 fake news outlets. And in a follow-up to that, in 2020, the bigger investigation uncovered the same network was actually, in fact, running 500 fake news outlets. So the point is, and then they also added that this is a mix of a lot of methods. So they have used traditional platforms like the European Union or the United Nations to further their agenda, and also used defunct NGOs and also revived a dead professor. And at the same time, they've used a lot of fake domains and fake news websites. So it's a mix of traditional methods, cyber warfare methods, and also on-ground activities. And this is what sets this whole network apart. And this has been going on for 15 years. The biggest thing that is very astounding to me as well is when the investigation came out in 2019, there was no noise. Nothing was done about it. In fact, the investigators of EU Disinfo Lab have even highlighted in their follow-up that came out in 2020 that despite us raising the issue and alerting UN and EU and all the stakeholders involved, including the Indian government, nothing was done about this. No investigation was done. And another thing is that some of the domains they highlighted, like EP Today, some websites that the network had established to post fake news about Pakistan, though some of the domains were unregistered after the first investigation came out, but then they reproduced under a different name. So even if some of their findings did have an impact, the network got stronger, and because they were not held accountable, they were allowed to reproduce and strengthen and expand their network to around 116 countries from 95 countries initially. So I think the lack of accountability from the stakeholders involved and the lack of coverage in international media is part to blame. Then at the same time, from our government side, I think if the same response that we have generated this time was given in 2019 when the first report came out, maybe we could have done something earlier on. And because the evidence was great in the first report as well. Second is that the sophistication and drive of this investigation, even the investigators have pointed out that it takes more than a few computers to do something like this. And like it's mentioned that it's not just about a fake news website, it's about on-ground activities. So this is why it's very problematic that these fake NGOs, fake journalists that the network was using were actually lobbying on ground outside the UN. And this also holds the UN accountable, that why did they let these NGOs or their platform be misused for disinformation? There is still no follow-up, no accountability done. And this is, and something that was pointed out earlier, if this was Pakistan that was exposed, the level of coverage internationally and the consequences would have been far larger than what India has been India has been treated with. So this is a failure on part of international organizations. And also, I think it's important to invest in evidence-based research in our response to such methods. Because yes, the EU Disinfo did a very good evidence-based research, but then these kind of researchers can come out from Pakistan as well. And we do need the capacity, we do need to improve our research and skill set that can counter and identify what disinformation really is. To define disinformation in this context is coordinated and intentional activity to malign a country. In this case, India was indulged in disinformation against Pakistan, but I don't see any coverage or any investment in identifying and countering disinformation, and also helping educate public in media literacy and how to identify how perceptions can be manipulated, how what hybrid warfare is. So and something that was highlighted earlier is that we don't need to indulge in disinformation as a counterattack or as a counter response. I think the better response would be to come up with evidence-based research like the EU Disinfo did. There are a lot of networks still, and also the Indian media is involved in doing this. So the research also pointed out that ANI, which is one of the largest wire services in India, has been recirculating fake news and negative news about Pakistan in 95 countries, and with the help of other fake news media outlets. So leading media is also involved in this organized campaign and the perception building, which is very pro-India and anti-Pakistan. These are things that are very easy to catch. These are things which are it just takes time and consistency to highlight them. So I think going forward, the better response would be to counter with evidence-based research, invest in fact-checking, media literacy, and counter disinformation by identifying it.
Thank you, Ramsha, for sharing your initial comments. And I completely agree and echo when you say that the level of sophistication is such that it's not just the fake news, it's various events, physical events that are taking place, and everything reinforces the one another. And definitely resources should be allocated inside Pakistan to, not only unearth such activity taking place in the country, but abroad as well, because one should not really wait for an EU NGO to, do the job for us. There should be some national level activities and responses to that as well. Thank you very much for sharing your initial remarks. Now we move on to our third speaker, and Mr. Mohammed Awais Anwar. Awais Anwar is Director of Research at the Research Society of International Law. He is also a Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Excellence for International Law at the National Defense University, Islamabad. His research interests include international law, criminal justice, and national security. Mr. Awais, I want you to focus on the legal aspect of this entire debate. What are the global rules, norms, and values against such disinformation campaigns? And most importantly, what are the legal consequences to such disinformation campaign against Pakistan? Definitely, as Mr. Mohd Yusuf also referred to the fact that there are investigations going on right now with the EU. Could you please elaborate for us what are the existing rules and norms, and what could be the legal measures that Pakistan can take against such evidences? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sita. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sita, can you hear me fine? Great. So again, as you mentioned, I will be focusing just on the legal aspects. I think our other speakers here are far more qualified to be discussing, strategic aspects or the aspects on rights and other issues. Just building on what Ijaz Haider Saab said, this is not a new phenomenon. We seem to be waking up to this now, especially with the impact that fake news has had on, say, the US elections or elections in the European Union. But this is not a new phenomenon. And in fact, I'd like to give our viewers a little bit of homework. There's a wonderful documentary called Operation Infection. You can find it on YouTube or anywhere. It's by the New York Times, and it really looks at how over the past 50 years or so, the KGB has utilized disinformation, misinformation campaigns against the United States, and they've been so subtle in their working that, and they haven't been trying to achieve major goals, with subtle goals in undermining the trust in institutions. And if you look at the campaign that the Disinfo Lab has uncovered, we also see major glimpses and in fact the same tools being used there as well. Now that we're waking up to this, development of policy at the international level as well as domestically within states has started happening. But it's a very difficult debate, and it's a very difficult question to answer from a legal perspective, because on the one hand, you have the issue of freedom of speech. And in 2018, the European Union had a committee of experts come in and advise the European Union on how to deal with Russian influence or Chinese influence or influence from other countries, operations that are taking place, how to deal with this. And their conclusion was, don't take any steps at the moment, because the infringement on freedom of speech, the right to freedom of speech, would be far greater than any benefit that could come to them. Nonetheless, there has been a push forward to regulate this sector at the international level as well as within states, and primarily within states in Western democracies. Previously, when it was just television or it was radio that were the main forms of communication, mass communication like that, we had mechanisms such as the US's honest ads legislation, where any advertisements, TV channels or radio channels, they had to keep data on who sponsored these, who paid for these, and whether they were providing correct information. Recently now, we have in 2018, the French government passing legislation on anything which impacted any form of disinformation, which was aimed at changing the sincerity of a vote. And that is now, very strange to see curbs on freedom of speech for this particular purpose. But it's not an easy answer. It's certainly something that is beyond my pay grade to come up with. How do you come up with this balance? And we have to think 10 times before we impose any sort of restrictions on freedom of speech. Now, another aspect to this is nations states that work in the domain of disinformation, that have made it a state policy, like India. We see Russia has been behind this as well. Others say that China has also had, has the capability to do this quite a bit. They also understand that this works both ways. That's why their hold on information within their countries is pretty strong. And that is why these nations are able to, have a one-way direction of misinformation going on. Now, what we also see in terms of India, because it does not have the same, capability as China, for example, of controlling information there, it is the number one source of disinformation, according to the Microsoft 2019 survey that took place. And this is causing, loss of life, very serious issues with regards to the social fabric of India. And we see that this is happening. Yet it's a tool that India is using internationally as well. Looking specifically at the disinformation lab and the information that we get from there, there's a number of things that have taken place, and I'll try to deal with them very briefly legally as well. So one, there are attempts at targeting the state of Pakistan, targeting individuals. There are entities which are being targeted. There's identity theft that's taking place, defamation of individuals that has been taking place, and the misuse of NGO status. Now, let me try to analyze these through two lenses. One is the international law lens. How do you deal with some of these issues? Well, defamation, these issues aren't dealt with through international law, they're done through domestic law. So what can we do at the international level? Well, first of all, these entities that were allowed to speak at UN forums, there's a mechanism of how they're allowed to speak. One is that they have to be registered or given consultative status with ECOSOC at the UN. So the UN's ECOSOC body gives them registration. And the mechanism that regulates this is ECOSOC Resolution 31 of 1996. And if you look through that, there are some mechanisms in place to keep a check on the abuse of entities using their platform. Now, if you go to the UN, and we know this because RSIL as an entity has applied for consultative status for the past four years, and the Indians are very sharp. They're always there in the meeting, and they will find some reason to delay or push our registration till next year. And similarly, Pakistan does the same with Indian entities. So what the Indians did in this was revive dead entities that already had consultative status. Right? Entities that in the 70s received this sort of consultative status, and then use that platform, bypassed the check, the guard that Pakistan had for new entities, and utilize this. how do you target entities that already have this consultative status? You do that by looking at the mechanism. So the UN, if we look at this particular resolution, 31 of 1996, it requires, that any entity can have its consultative status suspended or revoked for abuse of its platform. That is something that Pakistan should be doing. Secondly, entities can be denied consultative status if they abuse the authority or if they use it particularly for malign purposes. What Pakistan can also do is seek additional reporting requirements from these entities. And that is another requirement. Normally, under every 3 years, entities are, or every 4 years, entities are supposed to provide a report. But in exceptional circumstances, the entities that have been given consultative status can be asked to report immediately. And that is something I think we should be pursuing. Similarly, the UN Human Rights Council and that platform was abused by this entire network. And that is something that we need to look at. I think Pakistan should be working with its partners and its allies in enhancing the checks that take place for NGO registration and NGO using the UN platform for these NGOs. And there's a number of other things that we can discuss, and perhaps in the question and answers we will. But just on the domestic front, countries have defamation laws for the individuals who have been targeted. Sadly, states can't really invoke these domestic defamation laws. States like the United States, even India, I mean, a number of states around the world, especially in the European Union, have laws against identity theft. And that is exactly what these entities have done. There are a number of laws which deal with the deregistration, of and monitoring and accountability of NGOs. And that is something that we need to pick up and look at how, NGOs that have been registered in Belgium, for example, how did they abuse their position and how that can be tackled. We need to be looking at how media watchdogs, such as Ofcom in the UK, how that can be utilized. And Ofcom very recently, I think a few weeks ago, penalized an Indian news channel for, anti-Pakistan abusive language. And finally, what I just wanted to note, I mean, there are a number of these issues, but we seem to have a misunderstanding that, this was a covert entity. I think we all, Ramsha mentioned very rightly, that it was a seamless transition from the covert false fake news that was developed being then published by ANI, mainstream Indian media source. And if we were to forget all of this, just look at what Indian media today is saying. I mean, the garbage that you will hear on Indian channels, pardon me for using that language, is nothing short of what's been mentioned in these, in the report. So it seems to be one of the strategies that Trump had advocated, that if you say a lie, barefaced and as confidently as you can, there are no consequences. We have to be looking at how do you tackle, mainstream media in India for the lies and the fake news that they perpetrate as well. Sadly, at the international level, there isn't a mechanism, but there is a trend towards that. And I think Pakistan needs to play a very important role in developing and shaping the narrative on this. I'll just end there, and we can then certainly have questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vasanvar, for enlightening us what the legal measures are there, and I mean how they can actually be utilized, and what already is in place and what needs to be done in this regard. And thank you also for highlighting the challenge that actually might come when we are trying to control the fake news or the fake impersonification, such impersonification when it comes in clash with the freedom of speech aspect, because when you try to, I mean, that some controls to control the fake news and disinformation would actually end up infringing upon some freedom of speech aspects, which continues to be a challenge, particularly in European societies. And that's perhaps why some of these activities have continued to take place for this long. Thank you for sharing your initial remarks. We request the audience to please share your question in the question and answer box. There are a few questions already. We can start with that. Dr. Usman Chauhan has a and it's not a question to any specific speaker. Any one of you can respond to that. What is your view of the power of private companies, the social media giants, to police speech and to suspend certain world leaders, but not others, as We just recently seen in case of President Trump after 6 January's resurrection, what the Americans call was had happened to him. And secondly, EU Disinfolab is a small-scale organization that managed to use straightforward pattern recognition to detect the Indian Chronicles. So don't we risk exaggerating how sophisticated Srivastava group really was? Aren't we able to conduct similar detection? Perhaps, Ramsha, you can take the second question, and I would appreciate if Mr. Ijaz, Heather, and Awais Anwar could deliberate upon the first part of the question.
Who do you want to start?
Mr. Heather, you can go.
Is my audio okay? Because apparently some people said that.
Yeah, no, there is actually some noise when you speak. I don't know, there is some line issue perhaps.
Or am I audible? Am I clear? Or is there still some distortion?
There is still some distortion, Mr. Heather, I'm afraid.
No idea why that is so, because I have a hands-free which is connected to the laptop with Bluetooth, and normally it works fine. So I really don't know what the issue here is. So let Ramsha start. So let me see how I can work out my.
You are good now, by the way, if you can just want to go ahead now.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So the first part of the question, of course, is not in my wheelhouse, frankly. In terms of private entities, banning certain leaders and whether they should be allowed to do that or not. So this obviously has certain legal aspects to it. It could also be in terms of free speech and all that. And then, of course, you get into this veritable minefield of where do you draw a line and what exactly do you mean by free speech? Just like free market, there is no such thing as a free market. And to that extent, there is no such thing as an absolutely free speech. So the point really is, where do you draw the line? But as far as the legal aspect of it is concerned, I think that's where Awais can come in. Has to do with whether private entities are allowed to have that kind of oversight and that kind of authorization to actually say, well, X can speak and Y cannot speak. So as far as the second part of the question is concerned, that's been directed to Ramsha. So I guess you should get to Ramsha for all of you.
I'll shortly overview the first question as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure, please.
Yes, so the platforms have been very criticized for making a political statement by banning a sitting president that was Donald Trump. But then at the same time, everyone knows that platforms have a bias, and in this context of Indian disinformation, we have seen previously that a lot of times Pakistan government, and it has been raised that platforms also have a pro-Indian bias. And when the Kashmir issue happened in 2019, a lot of accounts were even reported to the platforms that were removed for posting pro-Kashmir. So the platforms rightly do have a political bias everywhere, and this is a wide criticism of them, that they're not doing enough to counter disinformation in other parts of the world. But then at the same time, I won't justify censorship or removing or censoring political speech because it's a world leader after all, and it also undermines access to information. But yes, it's true that platforms also do have a political bias. Going back to the second question about if it's been exaggerated or not, and if there is more to it or not. Like I previously pointed out, yes, the sophistication and drive is very, very coordinated. It's very technical, but then at the same time, the little aspects of the investigation are not hard to identify. And like it has been pointed out throughout, that Pakistan government and agencies were aware of the nature and the scope of Indian disinformation activities. So I'm sure that they are aware and they are doing something about it. But at the same time, it's not difficult to, for instance, the fake news websites they registered, or domain manipulation. Also on Twitter, how the Indian news websites coordinate and amplify fake news. All of these things are very identifiable and easy to pick up on. It just requires time and consistency. And that is why I hope there will be more research and follow-up investigation, and there will be more investment in this area. And also in terms of media coverage, more and more people will dig in. And I think there have been some follow-up investigations to fact check and also build up on the findings of EU Disinfolab by some local researchers. So yeah, I think it's a good step that we're digging further and identifying what the network was up to. But then at the same time, it's also up to the Indian government. What they say, even though the report says the there is no evidence that says that Indian government was directly involved, but the Srivastava group is based in India. So it goes back to the Indian government to actually investigate how an Indian group was nevertheless involved and indulged in a network that has been doing this for over 15 years.
Point that, if I sorry, Wes, just expanding on what one question about, this is a group that was also responsible for actually putting together a group of right-wing MEPs and taking them to the occupied and now illegally annexed Kashmir. And interestingly enough, there were a couple of Indian media outlets who actually looked at that operation and went back to look at where the funding was coming from, and who had registered this group and the various affiliates and all that. And I think the one outlet that took the lead in that was NDTV. So there is clearly a nexus between the Srivastava group and the Indian intelligence agency, in this case, either the Intelligence Bureau or the RNAW.
Yes, please, Wes, and please go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, just addressing the first question with regards to online platforms. There's some interesting developments here. First of all, I mean, how do these platforms? They have their internal standards. They have domestic law in the countries that they operate, and they have to abide by those. That's how Pakistan can send requests and take down Twitter tweets or things. But they only last till your border at Chaman and Wagah. They only affect Pakistanis. They don't affect that tweet will still be visible, or that Facebook page will still be visible to the rest of the world, right? So that's the problem with domestic law. The EU has a very interesting thing. They established a European Union code of practice on disinformation, and they define disinformation as verifiably false or misleading information, which is created, presented, and disseminated for economic gain or to intentionally deceive the public, and which may cause harm, public harm. So they took that standard and they had different social media organizations sign up to this. And in May 2019, we had Microsoft join, and Google, Twitter, Mozilla, and a number of others, TikTok, signing up to this. So I really think the future of whatever form of regulation there is, it has to be, with the smallest footprint possible, has to be joint action. And it has to be something at the international level. Now, the same restrictions do not apply to Pakistan that the EU has applied for itself. These entities are not going to do this for Pakistan unless we have a global action. We're too small a market. And as Ramsha very rightly pointed out, there is a significant pro-India bias because a lot of these entities have massive offices because India is such a big market for them and has a lot of value for these entities. And that's why what we need to see is through collective action, through collective international action, I think Pakistan would have a much better say in this and help whatever regulation develops in this to be developing right. Thank you.
Thank you for your take on the question by Dr. Usman Johan. I would move on to the next question from Mr. Bilal Shahid. He has directed his question towards Mr. Ijaz Haider. What role do you think our print and TV media can take to mitigate the corrosive impact of viral fake news on social media? What's the new equilibrium in this digital age? Can states maintain draconian information censorship in the garb of international security, or is it greater transparency the need of the hour? This is the question from Dr. Bilal to Mr. Ijaz Haider. That's
Well,
you mentioned earlier as well, but your take specifically on this question, please.
Right. So in reverse, firstly, I don't think that censorship is the correct response to this. And I think one of the things about censorship has to do with the fact that we seem to believe, and to my mind, somewhat erroneously, that the only way to defend against this kind of onslaught is to have a single meta narrative that runs through the state and society. That simply is neither possible nor justified, because different and differing voices per se do not mean that there is disharmony within the society. They simply mean that there is a clash of ideas, and it is through the clash of ideas that values are born. It's through a clash of ideas that our socio-political and constitutional compact is going to move forward. So I don't think that censorship is the response to this. As far as the media is concerned, now frankly, social media is a highly unregulated space. And this is without prejudice to what has been said and correctly pointed out that these organizations do have their political biases, and to that extent, they do tend to regulate on the basis of their political biases. But by and large, the social media space is unregulated, and therefore it's extremely difficult to, at this point in time, and I frankly am in no position to say how this can be done. There are other experts who can obviously look into this and figure out how to go about regulating it without that kind of censorship. As far as the mainstream media are concerned, there are voices. You have one on the panel, Ramsha. Ramsha looked at the tech side of things. He has been putting out brilliant analyses and reports. On television, unfortunately, the kind of programs that get television rating points are programs that are geared towards a different kind of topics. The conduct of those programs, by and large, frankly, is not something that I'm particularly enamored of. So I don't think that there is either the time or the skill set or the intention or desire or the will to actually develop the kind of capacity that could perhaps work towards identifying fake news in the social media.
Thank you, Mr. Ijaz. So now you did make a reference to hybrid warfare and fifth generation warfare earlier. So there is a question about how do we basically define these terminologies, and there is an associated question which also focuses on this aspect of this kind of warfare. And the narration it starts with is that it's been studied in various researches that every single country is vulnerable to one of the 5 identity indicator, that is historical, ethnic, religious, socio-economic, and geographic in nature. And if hybrid warfare works on tools like exploitation of those identity indicators by either provoking identity conflict or to transform the perception of reality by making the minds accept illusion as truth, or to believe that a false belief through affecting the minds of masses through the use of print and electronic media. So basically, they are giving an explanation of what how hybrid warfare works. So how far in scenario the role of psychological intervention can play its part to defend us against disinformation campaign? I mean, at one hand, how hybrid and fifth generation warfare, as you rightly stated, has been going on since forever, and perhaps to an extent we are misusing the terms. So it's good to, kind of define the terms again, and how that psychological intervention can play its part in to defend us against disinformation campaign.
Right, so that's a very long question. I'm not sure if I remember where it started, but here's the thing. I hope my audio is clear, because I just saw a comment where my point about this was misunderstood. Look, what I'm saying is, and I've said this for a very long time, these terms, hybrid war, this term fifth generation war, which seems to have come into vogue in Pakistan over the last 2 years, these are terms that somehow think that the nature of war has undergone a change. So that to me is a misconception. The nature of war does not change. The conduct of war, the tools in and through which you wage war, the levels at which you wage it, they definitely undergo change. Now, this fifth generation, back in 1989, William Lind came up with this term fourth generation. And this was, he wrote this for the United States Marine Corps Gazette. And this was titled, if I remember it correctly, The Changing Face of War into the Fourth Generation. For the last 2 years, we have added yet another generation to it, and turned it into fifth generation. My point is that go back to Sun Tzu and you will see there's espionage, there is perception management and manipulation, there is psychological warfare, there are a number of non-kinetic ways of waging war. What does Sun Tzu say? He says the first best is to win while without destroying the enemy's battalion. What does that mean? It simply means that the ultimate objective of any war is to break the enemy's will to fight. Now, if you can actually break the enemy's will to fight without using kinetic means, by actually in and through influence operations, by sowing discord, by making people despondent about the state entity where they live, by attacking the fault lines within the society, you are not using kinetic, but you are definitely targeting those very areas that create a force multiplier effect. And so therefore, when people talk about hybrid war, when they talk about fifth generation war, I kind of slink in my chair, frankly, because I feel that perhaps all they need to do is to go back and read the long history of military affairs to figure out that none of this is. Okay, what is new is that you now have the digital space. What is new is that you now have a battle space in the cyber. You have a battle space in the electromagnetic spectrum. You now have artificial intelligence. Your battles, even your physical battle space is integrated in and through what you can probably call Internet of Military Things. That is new, but those are tools. The nature and objective does not change. The tools change. For instance, people are now using artificial intelligence and determining how Twitter users, operate, what kind of ideas are being put out, how many of those ideas influence people, to what extent do they influence people, and so on and so forth. And of course, troll farms and the rest of it. And this is an area where Ramsha can give much better input than I can. So all I'm saying is that none of this is new. Just the tools to do these things have changed.
If I could just make one point here.
Yeah, please.
I fully agree with Ijaz Saab's critique of using this terminology, and I have a different angle to it. When people who understand warfare and understand it in its broadest understanding, it's still okay for them. But for the general public, when we use terms like hybrid warfare or fifth generation warfare, it kind of seems that these attempts are short-term, immediate objectives that are. Whereas if you look at the impact of disinformation, it is far wider than any military battle or any particular conflict. So, for example, eroding trust in institutions, that is a fundamental thing. A citizenry needs to be able to trust its institutions. And the US is a prime example. How the trust in people giving information on the coronavirus, how that has impacted the US. We now have crossed 400,000 deaths in the US. Eroding trust in vaccines, eroding trust in legal mechanisms. Just recently, eroding trust in American democracy itself. And this is also something that impacts, this is not just the US, but it impacts us. The impact of disinformation, I think by looking at it just through the prism of warfare and securitizing it like that, limits really our understanding of how insidious a tool this is. So I just wanted to bring that point in as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So if I may, because Ras is making a very, very important point. I would say that eroding trust in institutions is something where one also has to, and I would add must, look at why it becomes easy to do that, and to see whether there is something that inheres in the working of the institutions itself that makes it easier for people to begin to be suspect of them, and also for the external influences to actually target and push those buttons that I talked about in my earlier presentation, and to make it easier for people, and to make it easier for that to widen that fault line. So I think another problem, and this relates with what the point that Ras has made, with this term hybrid warfare in the last 2 years, we have also seen an attempt, sometimes forward, by certain sections to use this term and to try and stymie any discourse that is critical of the institutions, their functioning, or how the state operates. Now, to me, that is a very dangerous trend. And because that means that unless, and I'll again use that term, unless we are prepared to accept a single monolithic meta-narrative that is being pushed, we become anti-state. And I don't have to press this point to say how dangerous it is.
Thank you, Mr. Ijaz Haider. This also, Mr. Wasimuddin, the director at CAS, has also referred to this entire phenomena, and he says that perhaps this shouldn't come to us as a surprise, because is there any space for morality and ethics in modern day warfare? Because what has been done, what has been unearthed shouldn't surprise us. It was merely used as a tool against us, and we somehow has let our weaknesses to be exploited, and unfortunately not taking any concrete measures at the national level to counter this onslaught against us. Do you want to comment on this question? Or I would also wanted to add Mr. Muhammad Ali's question, who is also a director at CAS. His two-part question is specifically directed to Mr. Awais Anwar, and in which he says, in your assessment, whether the evidence presented in Pakistan's dossier can be proven in an international court against Indian entities. And second part of the question states, which international legal forum is the most suitable one for filing case against these entities? Mr. Vaz, can you take this question first and also comment on the previous question if you
Absolutely. The material that has been provided in, say, the dossier that the Foreign Office and the DJISPR presented, one is very persuasive. It certainly indicates India's involvement in terrorist attacks in Pakistan, the funding of it, and all of these things. But we have to understand there's a difference between material that is obtained as intelligence and material which is evidence. And what is the fundamental difference? Intelligence is gathered for operational purposes, right? We find out that a person is, a terrorist is planning an attack, making a bomb in a certain location. We get that intelligence, we plan a raid, we arrest him, right? Evidence is the material that is admissible in court. And it requires a chain of custody. It requires an entire process for us to bring to that institution. Now, we have to see that there are different international forums for this. For designating terrorist entities, primarily this is done on intelligence evidence, right? And that is what is submitted to these entities, but it still has to be very strongly backed, like the process has to be shown. This is like middle school or high school mathematics. You don't just show the result, you have to show the working, right? So similarly, we have to show the working. How did we obtain this? Is this reliable? Is this something that can be cross-checked, double-checked by other entities? And if you can show that and you can demonstrate that, then yes, this can be brought to, say, the UN Security Council committees that do the designation of terrorist entities. India has done this in the past. Pakistan has done this and tried to do this several times with limited success. And this is something we need to focus on. Why is it that when we repeatedly bring forth evidence, it is not looked at with the same urgency or with the same level of credibility that, say, evidence coming from India, because India backs it up with a number of other things, or India standing with countries who are on the Security Council who have the sway to push these through is greater. Now, this is for international forums. At the international international tribunals or courts such as the ICJ or the ICC, that is something that is a little more difficult because you might have the best case in the world, and we certainly have it on a number of issues, Kashmir being one of them. India has limited the ability for us to approach the court to take India to that court. So, for example, the ICJ, India has a declaration which accepts the court's jurisdiction. But in that declaration, it has put in a number of points which makes it almost impossible for Pakistan to take any case against India to the ICJ. The only reason the Kulbhushan Yadav case could be taken by India, because we have a similarly very strong reservation so that India can't take us to the ICJ, was because it wasn't through this declaration that they took us. They took us through a treaty that we had signed saying that if there was any problem with the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations with regards to its application, that dispute would be resolved by the ICJ. The problem is that there aren't many international mechanisms. The other option could potentially be the International Criminal Court, the ICC, but neither Pakistan nor India are signatories to that or have ratified its statute. And therefore it becomes, there are very limited options on that regard. But again, a lot of what happens at the international, we have a bad habit in Pakistan where we want to see a full-fledged victory or a full-fledged result coming out of something. International condemnation, isolation, those are some of the most potent tools that you have at the international domain. And if you can repeatedly show that India is utilizing irresponsible methods that is endangering the peace and security of this region, which it certainly has. We have Balakot, we have the dossier that Pakistan has brought forward, and we have the EU Disinformation Lab, which is just a pattern of evidence that is showing the trajectory that India is heading towards. That, I think, is something that we need to build up upon, and we also have to realize that this is not something that's going to happen overnight. India took years and years to build this narrative, 2 decades almost, to build this narrative that Pakistan is a state sponsor of terrorism. And it was successful only at the end then, right? Similarly, Pakistan needs to understand if we have to build a narrative, it's going to take time, but we have to be at it and consistently, bringing this to the fore. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may quickly ask some relevant point, as Mr. Moid Yusuf stated, that the evidence or the dossier that is presented now, how the question was asked, how is it different from the previous ones? Can we say that this is more strengthened on the actionable evidence front, or it's also some more intelligence backed up by more evidence-based intelligence, or how does this differentiate from the previous one on the legal point of view, legal perspective?
Okay, so I mean, I haven't seen the evidence, so I don't know. I've just heard the same press conference that you all have seen. I don't know if this, some of the evidence that showed, banking transactions taking place, whether that was obtained through a mutual legal assistance request to Afghanistan or to India or something along those lines. If it's done through that legal mechanism, then yes, that is proper admissible evidence, because those authorities certified it, then sent it to you saying this is certified legal from in our jurisdiction, and therefore you can use it within your courts. We now this year, because of the FATF pressure and stuff, developed a very cogent Mutual Legal Assistance Act, but in 2020. But this is, really the first time where we have a tool to utilize. And it is under this act that we can send requests like that. Before this, it was an ad hoc mechanism where states could comply or not comply. We really didn't have mechanisms to respond to other states' requests. So Pakistan, if it wants to be able to make any of the evidence properly admissible in a court, and even start cases in Pakistan, because the terrorist attacks took place here. Even in our own courts, we would have to show this link. Certified documents coming to us, documents that are verifiable, that are credible, all of those things. A lot of this can be done domestically, because if there are videos on people's phones that were captured, those can be through the legal process, the Qanun-e-Shahadat and the Criminal Procedure Code can be brought in as evidence, and a trial can be started on the basis of that. So domestically, we have a lot of tools, but when it comes to foreign information that we have in other jurisdictions, we're going to have to follow the correct procedure to be able to make this something that is cogent. Otherwise, people would just say, oh, this is a Photoshop document, or what proof do you have that this is correct? Why should we believe you on this? That is the credibility you need to build in these things. And that's why looking at these, not from a point scoring political angle, but from a legal angle is extremely important as well.
Thank you, Wes Anwar. This almost brings us towards the end of our time that we had allocated for this very interesting webinar, very engaging debates. Do our worthy panelists, do you have any last comments before we close the session and request President Kass for his closing remarks? Do you want to add some last comments, Ramsha and Ijaz Saab? Do you want to add something to the discussion? If not, that leaves us, that takes us to President Kass, Air Chief Marshal Kaleem Saadat. Sir, could you please wrap this up and share your concluding remarks with the audience? So you need to unmute yourself, please.
Always forget. Okay. Thank you very much, Sitara, for conducting this webinar very professionally. And I thank all the panelists for giving us a diverse view of the subject, starting from Dr. Moid Yusuf, Mr. Ijaz Haider, Ramsha Jahangir, and Mr. Wes Anwar. I will say a few words of my own, what is my perception of the whole issue, and then maybe go to the important points made by some of the panelists. My own view is, as has been expressed by some of the others, that there is definitely a connection between the government and this entire operation, because individual effort or effort made by an entity cannot persevere nor have the resources to continue this operation for 15 years. So nobody will be motivated enough to do this on his or her own. The next point that I want to make is that after having been caught, the Indians may be unhappy, yet inwardly, they would be quite satisfied that for 15 years, the operation went undetected, and they were significantly able to impact Pakistan's perception abroad or the image abroad. And so they will not be too unhappy, I guess. And we all agree, all the speakers, the panelists, etc., we all agree that this is not a recent phenomena. It's been going on at various levels, various tempo, but it's been part of state affairs forever. And like Mr. Ijaz Haider said, that in the nature of warfare has not changed. Deception has always been one of the tactics of warfare, and this was nothing more than deception. And it was obviously a sophisticated operation, the point made by Ms. Ramsha and by Sitara, a sophisticated operation over many domains, physical, cyber, diplomatic, and of course in the domain of deception. There was the general impression amongst the audience is that we failed to detect it. But Dr. Mueed Yusuf, wanted to disagree with that no, the state was aware and, we were not caught sleeping. But the general impression in the public is that we should have been able to catch up to it somewhat earlier. Yes, it is not a clear-cut battle. That's why it is called hybrid. There are various means adopted, so they are not kinetic, non-kinetic, and propaganda, etc. But the bits and pieces have been there. Of course, the report only reported the integrated picture of the whole thing. Mr. Awais Anwar has obviously very ably highlighted the options that are available to us. And he has also made an important point that there are no instant results available to us. It is going to take a time. It is for the long haul. And on our part, it requires interministerial coordination, between Ministry of Information, Ministry of Law Affairs, Ministry of Law, and the Foreign Office to create an integrated plan to be able to do something similar. There is a difference of opinion between various analysts whether it is fair to do similar thing or not. Ms. Ramsha pointed out that we should, instead of doing these so-called illegal things, we should do research, and with research come out with facts, which we could put up to the whole world and impact Indian image. My view is that it's a war, and anything that succeeds must be resorted to. So there is no legality or illegality in war, and India doesn't care how it does it. It resorts to all kinds of means over there. The next point I want to make, and has been made by various speakers, is that fake news is a powerful tool. And look what Mr. Trump did to America, what it inflicted upon America. Democracy was on the run from these insurrectionists, and America has not seen the last of Mr. Trump. Only yesterday, I think it was BBC, which said that in his 4 years, Trump has dished out 30,500 falsehoods. Can you imagine this? From the President of the United States, 23 lies every day. That is the calculus that they have done. And if nobody less than the United States, President of the United States can use this tool, then everybody else can use this tool. Then there is the issue of freedom of speech, and of course, protection of public security and life, etc. I think Twitter was right in banning him because he had already caused a lot of chaos, and the Trumpian philosophy is going to prevail. I don't know how long it will take, if and ever anybody is able to negate it in any way. And we also realize that it has to be used, social media has to be used intelligently, and it has become, or it has been for a long time, a veritable tool in the conduct of contemporary politics and affairs of the state. It is a new normal, and we have to accept, and we have to adapt to it and be able to use it for our own benefit. It is good that My last question was about where do we go from here? What have we learned from this? And all our speakers very ably have highlighted what we have learned from it, what are the lessons, and how could we move ahead, what is the way forward, etc. And of course, the main domain is lawfare. And lawfare, unfortunately, has not been very popular in Pakistan. There is a tendency to be towards vigilantism. If we don't like somebody, we'll pull out a gun to shoot him. But if the law punishes someone, we will go all out to protect him. That's the kind of mindset that we have. But with 5th of August and with this Disinfo Lab, everybody has realized the importance of lawfare, because there is no military option to solution of these problems. And the only way that we have forward is through the application of the law or to resort to law. And that Mr. Awais and other people, Bilal Sufi and all, they are doing, putting in a lot of effort to be able to succeed in that domain. So with that, I will thank you once again. It has been very interesting discussion and very enlightening discussion. Actually, at the beginning, I asked Mr. Ijaz Haider whether there had been any webinar or TV program on this, and he said that Indus TV had done 2 programs. Actually, and that's my fault personally. The local TV has now become so torturous that you don't want to watch it. So I don't watch it. And that's perhaps the reason that I was unaware that there was a program. But having said that, let me say that it has been very useful for us. And we will, of course, convert it into a report, and that will be available for our record and for the archives. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. Allah Hafiz.